to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. Tim and I, PRI Senior Director of Communications, and I had a conversation with PRI fellow Damon Dunn on his new book, Punting Poverty, Breaking the Chains of Welfare. Damon, a former collegiate and pro football player turned entrepreneur, gives his thoughts on welfare dependency, racial disparities, universal basic income, and his favorite topic, education and skills-based economics. And you have to listen to the end, because Damon ends with a great story about his college days at Stanford and an encounter with another great athlete. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to Next Round, Damon.
Thank you for having me.
So PRI is very proud to publish your first book, Punting Poverty. So let's set it up for our listeners. Tell us about the book, why you wrote it, and what's your main message?
You know, I started looking back at my family experience. I would go home and visit my mom and my grandparents, and I was raised by my grandparents. And I noticed ever since I've been going back, since I went back from college and playing in the NFL, and even now when I go back, my grandparents, all of their people in the community and their children all still live in that exact same community. They're all still poor. And the people who I grew up with, which were the grandchildren, they're actually living there now. And it got me to thinking, all these people and all these families are living in the same neighborhood. They never had any upward progress. They never had any upward social, economic mobility. And it made me start thinking, what's going on here? Why are people getting stuck? You know, they're all using programs that were considered a part of the war on poverty, that when they were promised, the idea was that they would have upward socioeconomic mobility. And I found that they didn't. And when I started doing some research, I started to connect some dots for myself. I remember my grandmother, when I was 7 or 8, she stopped working. And it's funny now, I know why she stopped working. She stopped working because there were 10 of us living in the household, and we had free and reduced lunch. We had the government cheese program. We were on a housing subsidy. We had food stamps, and her additional income added with my grandfather's income would have given us too much income, and we would not be able to qualify for those benefits. And the issue with that is that if we don't qualify, it would take tens of thousands of dollars to replace all those benefits that the 10 of us were benefiting from. And so it just wasn't feasible for her to go $1 or $200 over the threshold and lose tens of thousands of dollars of benefits. And I started to look at the effects of those types of policies that keep people in poverty. And that's why my friends are still there. That's why my grandparents are still there. That's why my uncles, my grandparents' children. And you start looking back, you've got 5-6 generations of poverty that's being handed down. And that really made me, want to write this book, to start talking about some of the unintended consequences of public policy that does not give people incentives to move up. Because when my grandmother quit her program, or rather when she quits her job, that means no more saving money so they can buy a new house and maybe move into a better community where there's safer schools and schools that have technology. And there's no more saving money so that one day we could buy a home that was inside the city as opposed to the county where we had septic and burn our own trash. So it really worked against the opportunities that were promised to them as they went into it. All of them are still there. And I wanted to write a book to talk about these consequences.
So Damon, a big part of your book is making the case against universal basic income, or UBI, as some might call it. UBI was championed in the presidential primaries by Andrew Yang. And now you see Speaker Pelosi is also floating the idea of guaranteed income. And for those of us in California, we know it's being tested for some families in Stockton, California. So in your view, why is universal basic income a bad idea?
I'm a business guy, so it happens, to impact my acumen when I review public policy, whatever filter we all have. We typically see it through the lens of our own backgrounds. And I simply start with, what's the return on investment, right? We're talking about a $2 trillion investment to give all Americans over the age of 18, $1,000 a month. So that's a significant amount of wealth that we're transferring. And what are we going to get for the $1,000, right? Are we going to get a new skill set where people can go out and have a job where they can be able to save money to buy a home, to be able to send their kids to college, to be able to, retire, maybe leave an inheritance? What does the $1,000, get us? What does it get each individual that's going to receive the money? And it's really small because there's nothing you can do with $1,000 except for pay a few household expenses. And so the return on investment just isn't there as opposed to the impact that it would have on the debt that we have in the U.S. And you're talking about adding that to existing, wealth, or I would say for entitlements that are not funded now. Social Security is not funded long term. Medicaid, Medicare, neither one of those are funded long term. And the Affordable Care Act obviously is not funded long term. And so adding another entitlement on top of that, that's going to, to the tune of $2 trillion to get someone just to be able to pay for some disposable expenses around the home. There was no value in that. No one's moving up the socioeconomic ladder. And I believe that if we're going to take U.S. Treasury dollars and we're going to invest in the American people, we need some type of return on investment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, later on in the program. But it just was not going to meet the promise and expectation that Nancy Pelosi and Mr. Yang were communicating, which is upward socioeconomic mobility for people that are working class, working poor, or severely low income.
You're an entrepreneur and you've had to struggle with your business during the coronavirus pandemic, like so many small business owners. Tell us about your path to becoming an entrepreneur, and what's your message to entrepreneurs and small business owners right now who are facing these tough times?
Yeah, these are unprecedented times, given that the government has unilaterally decided to shut down, certain sectors of the business and picking winners and losers. You're essential. Other of you are not essential. And I think what it comes down to is you have to have a business model that can withstand, a business model and a skill set that can withstand recessions. And effectively, that's what we're considering this. It's, buying power and spending have stopped and or slowed down significantly. And so you need to have a business model that understands that type of cyclicality, even though this is man-made, government-made. And the two things I can think of, one is education. Every recession that we've gone through, people that have the most amount of education, they are the last fired and the very first hired. So education has significant impact on your ability to withstand recessions. Now that's talking about the future, your children. We want to make sure we're preparing them, for the future with the most amount of education and skills that they have. And then secondly, I would say having a skill set that even during these days, which is tied to education, gives you the opportunity to continue within the job and on the path that you have. And I think that if you look at people who have graduate school degrees, people who have college degrees, they are still doing well. Now there are people who are just in the business right now, and they're not going to be able to go back today and get a new education or go get a new skill set. And they have to weather the storm between now and whenever buying power comes back, whenever the governors decide to open up marketplaces. And I would say there it requires you to be very, you have to be nimble, you have to be proactive, you have to be creative. I say that because you should be applying for the PPP dollars, Personal Protection Program, which allows people to gain access to pay off, they can pay labor, you can pay rent, you can pay down interest on loans that you may have. So you should be in that program. You ought to make sure that they've just extended that program as well. So you want to make sure that you understand which banks are offering that, because they're offering it through the SBA, and the SBA has certain approved banks that are within the areas where your business is located. And so you want to go get approved and you want to get access to those loans. You want to be able to go to your landlords. If you have a business where you're renting, you want to be able to renegotiate or ask for some type of furlough of rent that's being paid. And these ideas sound like minutia. It is. It's those who can do these things and be the most nimble who are going to withstand it. And then the people that can't, they're going to be in a position where their business may go away and it may not come back.
Let's get your take on the Black Lives Matter movement. What do you think about the movement, and what are your thoughts on this, conversation that we've been having, over the past several weeks about overcoming racism in this country? What's your message to African Americans?
That's a great question. So, be patient with me because I've got a lot to say about it. Obviously, it's a personal message to me. And so I understand the reason you're seeing worldwide, kind of coalescing around, this Black Lives Matter movement is because I think historically, pretty much on every continent, brown people have been, I wouldn't say demonized, but certainly been left out of building wealth, certainly had discrimination on a worldwide basis. And I think people are feeling that all across the world. And it made it more convenient to do it through the COVID-19 because everyone's home now, right? Usually we're all at the movies or doing our jobs at work or going to sporting events, and an event happens like George Floyd and no one, few people hear about it, but we just keep living. But we're all silent now and we're all sitting at home and everyone's feeling the weight of that happening times 2 or 3 when you add the other incidents. And so I do feel like there is an air of brown people feeling as if they have been discriminated against on a worldwide basis, and there's a lot of frustration with that. Now we have to talk about what are the fixes, what are the solutions to feeling this way, what are the solutions to the specific things that have happened. There's some specific things, in regards to criminal justice system about profiling, and there's some things like that we can change. But I think it's bigger than that. I think it's about building wealth, and to me, it's not just for Black lives. But I do feel like the Black lives that are feeling discriminated against and like they have not been a part of building wealth, I think that you have to understand that people have told you that if you can vote, if you can sit at the front of the bus, if you can go to the same schools as whites, then you're going to be equal. And I can tell you that equality doesn't start with just those civil rights. It was important to get those civil rights when we didn't have them. But you don't feel a lot equal when you're living in a poor school, in a poor community, and you're around drugs and you're around violence. At some point, you've got to demand the 40 acres and a mule. At some point, you have to start building wealth. And I've had a chance to do that. And I can tell you that I felt a lot more equal when I've had money than when I was really poor. And so I think it comes back to this commitment to deciding, we need resources to build skill sets. Building a skill set is your passport to go into the free market and to get a job. It's your passport, Tim, to do the job that you're doing at PRI, you and Rowena both. Even Sally, she's getting paid for a skill set that she has. If you're a basketball player, you're LeBron James, you have a marketable skill set that allows you to go make millions of dollars. I mean, you could be a plumber, you can be a radiology technician, you could be a certified nursing aide. You need a passport to be able to go and get a job that is just not minimum wage. And that's what I would tell people in the Black Lives Movement. It's more important than just removing the chokehold from police that are able to use that certain position. It's more than just feeling, as if we're going to protest and we're going to go and, make people notice and hear what we're saying. At some point, we have to get serious about demanding skill sets, because that's the only thing that's going to allow you to build wealth. And only when you start building wealth in juxtaposition with these civil rights will you start to feel a lot more equal.
So, Damon, you know that Prop 209, the California constitutional amendment that ended race and sex preferences in education, hiring, and government contracts, will be on the November ballot. Make the case that if there are to be preferences, it ought not to be based on race and sex, but on an individual's economic status. So, for example, you think that a young person who probably grew up in poverty, went to an urban public school, which perhaps doesn't have strong academics, but the kid has excellent grades, whether they be African American or Hispanic or white or Asian, they ought to be given a shot at a good school. So expand your thoughts on this idea.
Let me just acknowledge right up front that I don't believe that women are paid the same as men for the same jobs in the job sector in corporate America. I think that there's still some covert institutional racism where people of color, Black, brown, all people of Black and brown still don't have the same opportunities. Just look at the numbers of Black and browns at historic universities, even women, how many women are at these schools. So I want to acknowledge that up front, because what I'm going to say is going to be a little bit different than what a lot of people who are liberal would agree to. There was a time when Blacks had public policy that specifically said you couldn't vote, that specifically said you couldn't eat at a certain restaurant with whites, you couldn't go to certain schools. And we get Brown versus Board of Education. Some of those things start to equal out. And so I get it. We want to reduce some of these things down to race. We want to reduce some of these things down to gender. But the reality of it is, I grew up in a trailer in Mansfield, Texas, and I lived with my grandmother, and I didn't have a father, and my mom left me behind, and we were on all the welfare programs that we talked about. But you know what? Most of those kids down there in those trailers, they were white, and they had the same problems that I had. Those white kids, they had broken families. Some of them didn't have fathers at home. Those white kids in that poor area, they had the same schools that I had, underfunded, no access to technology, violence and gangs in our communities, recidivism, people going to jail and coming back, a lot of bad influences. no opportunity for good work and good jobs for their parents, poor education, no commitment to education, without two-parent households having these young people be committed. And I found, if I'm being really honest, it's just as hard as a poor white kid that grew up in a trailer park where I grew up as it is for a poor black kid. And so for me to sit here and say that, Prop 209, that we want to have policies that put gender and race at the forefront of decision making, to say that that's equal and fair, I can't say that's fair. Think about this right now. My daughter goes to private school in Los Angeles. I paid $20,000 a year for her to go to this private school. She's getting ready to go to a private high school. It's probably going to cost $36,000 a year. And she's a black female. So should that black female, who is what Prop 209 would identify, someone who should have an opportunity over someone that's white, should my daughter, who's going to private school, who has a wealthy father, have an opportunity over a poor white kid where I grew up? No, that doesn't make sense to me. That's just not fair. It is just as hard for that kid who doesn't have two parents at home, who's dealing with the same things I dealt with growing up, to make it out. And it's a lot easier for my daughter because of the resources I have for her. So race and gender are not the right, they're not the right variables to determine access to university and access to opportunity. It's socioeconomic level. And when you bring it down to socioeconomic level, everyone participates in that, in all races, all genders. And that, to me, if you're going to point someone out to have an opportunity that will not be given an opportunity to others, it has to be given on the basis of socioeconomic status, because everyone is eligible. And really, honestly, if everyone would admit it, it's just as hard as those Latino and blacks and browns and whites and male and female that grew up in those poor areas. It's just as hard for them to get through the system like I've gotten through it. And so, no, I don't agree that we should use race and gender as a variable to give access to college, to universities, and to jobs. I just think that that's unfair for my daughter to get an opportunity over a poor white young kid. I just can't agree with that.
As a follow-up to that, Damon, in your book, you talk about the concept of skills-based economics, which you believe is a key to moving out of poverty and putting people on the path to prosperity. Tell us about your idea.
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked about that, Rowena. Let's start here. If you go to any continent in Africa, any country on the continent of Africa, and you give them all of our economic policies, are they going to produce the same amount of gross domestic product as the United States? No. Why? Because they don't have a skilled workforce. If you go to Mexico and try to get a home built as just an individual person, a custom home, you're going to find that it's going to take twice as long to build one in the United States. Why? Because they don't have the same amount of skilled labor that we have in the United States. So skilled labor is really what allows 310 million people to produce almost $20 trillion of gross domestic product. And you look at 1.3 billion people in China, and they're producing about 15 trillion. So they have 5 times more people and producing a lot less gross domestic product than what we're producing. Why is that? Because we have the highest skilled labor force in the world. And so skilled labor is the key to be able to create wealth for a country. It's also the key to be able to create wealth for an individual. The people who have the most skills are the people who are able to get meaningful jobs, who are able to then buy a home, and you're able to, hopefully be able to retire one day and to leave an inheritance. And, back in the early 1900s, Rowena, there was a movement, and most people may not know this. There was what was called the high school movement. Up until like 1900, people only really went to school through 8th grade. No, there was no high school. And as we move from an agricultural-based economy more to a industrialized economy, we saw the need that there was more skill sets required for people to go into manage these machines and be in the manufacturing and ultimately producing, all the weapons and materials and transportation for both of the wars, World War I, World War II. And we need another movement like that because we're at another, what I call threshold of a change in history in our economy. We're moving more towards automation, information, artificial intelligence, software. And as we move towards that, we have to reimagine what schooling and education looks like. And right now, we're graduating on average 3.6 million high school seniors per year. And those high school seniors are no more qualified than someone who completely dropped out of school. Both of those groups can go work at McDonald's, but that's it. So why do we even celebrate graduating high school? There's no reward in that. You can't go get a real job. So what I would propose is that we would have high schools and community colleges would come together, and they would create two tracks, one that would lead us towards of a vocation for people who are not going to go to college. So on 5 years, I would hope that we could create that type of program, 9 through 14, where, over 5 years, you can finish with a vocation, trade, license, some type of passport that allows you to go into the workforce and to get a job that's not minimum wage. Or you finish, if you want to go to a 4-year school, with 2 years of college done, which would reduce your debt burden as you then transition out. The way I would propose paying for that would be we would cut across the board from foreign aid. We spend about $50 billion. We could easily cut 10 to 20% across the board. And then I would primarily focus on bringing community college professors to high school campuses, that the high schools and the community colleges would work together to create curriculums that allow people to be on a track for vocation or a track for a 4-year school. And they would come over to those facilities, so we would have to transport students over. They would be given funds from the federal government to just transfer fees from the Department of Education to pay for the new faculty and materials that are required. And that would be done if the state legislatures would pass policies that would allow them to transition to a 9 through 14 or K through 14 type of program. So I think that if we can graduate 3.6 million students that either have a vocation, certificate, or license, or are on their way to a 4-year school and they finish with an associate's degree, that would immediately pick up our skilled labor force and allow more people to get meaningful work, as opposed to just a job where you go and you put in, X amount of hours for the minimum wage that won't allow you to own a home or start building wealth.
Well, Damon, we can't let you go without talking a little bit of sports. So, as our listeners may know, you played for college football for Stanford and also in the NFL. And so against the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic, give us your perspective on how we should reopen sporting events, which is such an important part of American culture, and it's an important part of the economy. And I think everybody needs a little bit of release. We'd love to put a ball game on, and have a little, I'd love to watch the Trojans whenever they're on soon. Hopefully they'll be playing, but I think that's a little bit up in the air too.
Yeah, I'm a free market guy, so that's going to translate into my sports philosophy as well. I mean, look, let the guys play. Be responsible. Get them tested. Make sure people who are tested, who have the coronavirus, that they're actually not playing and get quarantined for the appropriate amount of time. But they should be allowed to go play sports. There are some vulnerable people who are in our population that have higher risk, to I would say it being a lethal, condition if you receive COVID-19, and those people need to stay at home and or find additional, resources to either remediate that if they get sick and go to the hospital, or hopefully resources that are given to them for them to be able to stay home and not be able to work. But I'm all for opening sports up and getting back to normal. But there should be testing, and outside of testing, people should just have to be responsible. You can't close the economy. I mean, these governors, they're like dictators right now. They have and I think they're probably just realizing it, that this is a loophole in the system, that somehow, wow, we're in a pandemic and we get to choose the economy to close down, who are essential business, who are non-essential. And we get to choose when you start, when you open, however I want to do it. And there's no checks and balances like through the typical assembly or state legislature process, where you have, two houses of the assembly and a governor trying to work through. And that really creates accountability. The governors have no accountability. They all get to dictate when and how they're going to open. And then you're starting to see that there's a lot of political posturing as a result of that. And I just think that that's unfair. You're going to have California governor not going to let sports play, but then the Florida governor is letting the entire NBA come there. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. That's a loophole in the system. We got to fix it. We can't have all these little mini dictators running around.
Should we have fans in the stands again, or just have them play to empty stadiums and arenas?
Listen, personally, I would have fans in the stands. It's like the flu. If you get the flu, that's on you. You sit by somebody with the flu. If you want to go out, you're taking the risk. It's your responsibility. We're all free. Now, I get it. There are some public health responsible things that we need to do, but every American has to take responsibility for themselves. That's who we are. That's our identity. To have some czar at the top that sits back and says, we're going to determine when your business can open, when your sports can be played, and we don't have any we can't give you what the trends are going to be from a preliminary perspective. We'll let you know when we get there. I just don't like it. So yeah, I would have people in the stands personally. I let business open back up personally, and I would tell the sick and the vulnerable to make sure that you're being responsible and not putting yourself in harm's way.
So finally, Damon, you have a great story about one of your fellow classmates in your Stanford days. And I think it's a really terrific, uplifting way to end our podcast today. So how about retelling it for our listeners?
Yeah, I was, never forget, I was 18 years old. I was a freshman at Stanford. We played Arizona State. It was a night game, and we played on the road. And I scored a 100-yard touchdown. That's not important. Just wanted all the listeners to know that I was balling. And so we came back to campus, and it was midnight, and it was raining. And, like typical college athletes, we were going to go to some parties. So we all took showers at the facility, and we drove by the backside of campus, by the driving range to all the fraternity houses. And there was this one guy that was at the driving range at midnight, hitting golf balls by himself. And I thought to myself, I was like, what is he out there hitting golf balls for? 3 o'clock in the morning, we go home, and this guy was still out there at 3 o'clock in the morning hitting golf balls by himself. And so I saw him in the training room the next day because we were both freshmen. I was playing football. He was playing golf. And I was like, Tiger, what were you doing hitting golf balls at 3 o'clock in the morning by yourself? And he looked at me with a straight face, with no emotion. And he said, whenever it rains, I have to work on my rain game. And he was serious, and I was joking, but he was dead serious. And so I look back on that, and it was really, really informative on what success looks like. Anybody can show up early once. Anybody can stay late once. Anybody can have one good year. Anybody can do good, in one class or on one test. But can you do it over and 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 over till it's no longer extra work? That's your normal level of productivity. In other words, can you maintain high levels of intensity over an extended period of time? And that's what Tiger was talking about that day. And that's really what allowed me to be a straight A student. That's what allowed me to play in the NFL at my size. That's what has allowed me to be successful in business. And then be able to join think tanks like the Pacific Research Institute. There's a commitment to excellence, and it's a drive and a grind. And the people that display that, you're going to have a chance to have a lot of success. And the people that don't, doesn't mean you won't be successful, but you're certainly, limiting your opportunities.
Thanks so much, Damon. Special thanks to Damon Dunn and Tim Anaya. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, and now iHeart. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.